Right. The Wabash River Valley saw sustained growth between 1825 and 1860. Demand for new buildings brought an influx of carpenters and builders, and this period saw the emergence of the earliest documented architects in our region. Aided by builders' guides and pattern books, and often by training in eastern states, these men began to shape the emerging profession of architecture in the Wabash Valley. Some would settle permanently in Indiana, while others would move south or farther west. This evening, we will learn about the lives and works of a group of master builders practicing in a prosperous 5-county section of the Wabash Valley between 1825 and 1860. The Wabash flows nearly 500 miles through Indiana and provided one of its most important early transportation corridors, connecting to the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Indiana became a territory of the United States in 1800 and entered the Union as the 19th state in 1816. In 1818, the Weah, Miami, Delaware, Pottawatomie, and Wyandotte ceded most of central Indiana up to the Wabash River to the United States in the treaties of St. Mary's. Beginning about 1820, Euro-American settlers from eastern states began to move into the Wabash Valley. Most of the land north of the Wabash was ceded to the United States in treaties through 1832, after which many Native Americans were forcibly removed to make way for further settlement. Euro-American settlers found the region's fertile land supported the production of crops and livestock beyond the needs of even the fastest growing communities that sprang up along the river. While they had surplus products, farmers faced the challenge of transporting them to markets where they would be in demand. Roads were impractical for long-distance shipment of agricultural products, but waterways offered opportunity for easy and fast shipment. The Wabash provided a connection to ports on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Large-scale shipment to and from the larger East Coast cities required a sea voyage from New Orleans, around Florida and up the Atlantic coast. This disconnect between the populous East Coast and the growing Western states would be remedied by the construction of canals, creating an inland water route from New York to the Mississippi. Half the solution was realized with the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, creating a navigable water route from the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes. The second half would connect Lake Erie to the Ohio River. The Ohio and Erie Canal was the first segment, and then the Wabash and Erie Canal, which first opened in 1847. So the first segment of the Wabash and Erie that actually opened to service was in 1843 between Lake Erie and Lafayette. It was gradually extended south, reaching Attica in 1847, Terre Haute in 1849, and the Ohio River at Evansville in 1853. Totaling 468 miles in length, it remains the second longest canal ever constructed on Earth, surpassed only by the Grand Canal of China. The construction and opening of the canal sparked a boom of development, commerce, and speculation along its route. Countless carpenters, house joiners, masons, master builders, and architects flocked westward to meet the demand for new buildings. Railroads first reached the Wabash Valley in 1852, prolonging the canal boom in towns along their routes. My research focuses on a 100-mile stretch of the Wabash in Cass, Carroll, Tippecanoe, Fountain, and Warren counties. This subregion saw dramatic growth in the 20-year period following the opening of the canal and includes a range of towns representative of the entire region. Lafayette, the seat of Tippecanoe County, was the largest city on the Wabash in 1850, with a population of about 6,000. Logansport, the seat of Cass County, was next with about 2,000, followed by Attica in Fountain County with 1,700, Delphi, the seat of Carroll County, with 1,300, and Covington, seat of Fountain County, with 1,100. Far smaller was Williamsport, the seat of Warren County, with a population of less than 300. Most early architects and builders in the region were trained as carpenters and used this term to describe their occupation. At the time of the 1850 census, the towns in the study area, with a combined population of nearly 13,000, contained 337 carpenters, who accounted for 2 to 3% of the total population of each town. The enumerator at Attica even distinguished between carpenters, of which he found 5, house joiners, of which he found 2, and carpenters, of which he found 5, house carpenters, of which he found 2, and house joiners, of which he found 51. Many carpenters' households included younger men of the same occupation who were likely apprentices or employees. The household of 33-year-old Lafayette carpenter John Allen included a 19-year-old carpenter named Thomas Wilson, who was likely an indentured servant. Some carpenters were adult children living with their parents, while many lodged in hotels and boarding houses or with private families. The family of Matthew Weaver, a laborer, had 6 German immigrant carpenters aged 20 to 35 boarding with them. The member of the Weaver family who met with the census enumerator apparently did not know the boarders' names because they are listed simply as Germans. The earliest documented builders in the Wabash Valley are known primarily from their work on public buildings and occasionally through lawsuits or later recollections. To date, no comprehensive documentation in the form of account books or other written records of the work of any 19th century Wabash Valley architect or builder is known to exist. Surviving documentation skews toward the prolific late 19th century practitioners who styled themselves architects and whose works were more thoroughly documented. In 1834, practitioners in the region's largest city formed the Society of the Master Carpenters and Joiners of Lafayette, suggesting a population of builders cooperating to establish terms for their mutual benefit. Although the subsequent history of the organization is unknown, 3 of the 13 founding members held contracts for work on the first Tippecanoe County Courthouse, begun in 1829. William Cannot worked on the construction of the courthouse, and Raleigh Swearingen and John Urey appear to have finished out the interior of the courtroom in 1833. The earliest architect in the Wabash Valley whose drawings survive is Dyer P. Edmonds. Born in Pomfret, Connecticut in 1804, Edmonds may have worked in New York City in the 1820s. He seems to have left New York around 1830, married Aveline Amelia Chapin in Hamilton, New York in 1831, and came to Lafayette sometime between 1831 and 1836. In March of 1836, the Tippecanoe County Commissioners acknowledged that the 5-year-old courthouse had been outgrown and sought to contract with a suitable workman for the erection of a clerk's office and recorder's office building and a county library building elsewhere on the public square. The 31-year-old Edmonds submitted a proposal for a 2-room county office building and a 1-room clerk's office. He included plan and elevation drawings accented with watercolor, and these are in the collection of TCHA. Shortly after receiving the contract, Edmonds advertised in Lafayette, Indianapolis, and Cincinnati newspapers, seeking 6 or 8 journeyman carpenters and also 20,000 good shingles. Edmonds completed the county office buildings in 1837, and they were used until 1854, when they were demolished to make way for larger, fire-resistant office buildings that would survive until the present courthouse was built in 1881. Edmonds is typical of many early builders associated with a single public project, with little else known of his career. Other sources provide fragments of information about Edmonds' life in Lafayette. We know that he served on a committee for the 1836 Independence Day celebration, and that he was secretary of an 1839 meeting regarding construction of the county seminary, Lafayette's first public school. He and Aveline may have been the parents of a 2-year-old child named Edmonds who died in 1839 and was buried in the Lafayette City Cemetery off Clark Street north of town, which is now the old city cemetery section of Greenbush Cemetery. The 1840 census indicates that the Edmonds family included only Dyer and Aveline. Edmonds died in 1842 at age 38. He was also buried in the Lafayette City Cemetery, with Masonic rites performed by the Perry Lodge, of which he was a member. Dyer P. Edmonds died at the beginning of a boom of development around the construction of the Wabash and Erie Canal. It's worth pausing to consider that today, 182 years after his death, there is nothing in Lafayette that Edmonds would recognize. The city we know would be as much of a mystery to him as the Lafayette of his day is to us. Carpenter David Hopwood offers a similar example. Born in Maryland in 1814, Hopwood settled in Lafayette around 1843, working there until his death in 1854 at age 40. From at least 1847 to 1849, Hopwood practiced in partnership with John M. Lloyd, a carpenter from Newburgh, New York, who settled in Lafayette in the 1830s after practicing in Chicago. In 1847, the town of Lafayette paid Lloyd and Hopwood for building a new city market house near the south end of the market space on the west side of Fifth Street between Main and Columbia. It may have looked something like this early city market in Indianapolis. The market house was demolished in 1864 and never replaced. In 1893, the Lafayette Courier reported on the visit of John McGee, who had left Lafayette for the West in 1857 and was returning to the city for the first time in 36 years. The Courier noted, Mr. McGee served an apprenticeship at the carpenter's trade with the firm of Lloyd and Hopwood at this city beginning in 1849. And the 1850 census shows us that a John McGee was an 18-year-old carpenter living in the household of John Lloyd. Hopwood presumably built many other buildings during these boom years, but his only other known project is the Greek Revival cottage that he built for himself around the time of his marriage in 1846. He is known to us today only because a preservation-minded couple, Michael and Phyllis Hunt, purchased the house and rehabilitated it and decided to research its history. And they found that David Hopwood purchased the lot for $400 in 1844, and that he sold the property for $3,000 in 1852. They found that Hopwood married Harriet Dunlap in 1846 and saw that the 1850 census listed his occupation as carpenter. The Hopwood house is typical of Greek Revival buildings built in the Wabash Valley by local builders working with architectural pattern books. The house's frieze and portico columns follow the Greek Doric order as illustrated in most American pattern books of the 1830s and 1840s. Hopwood's business partner, John M. Lloyd, built his own house at the southwest corner of 9th and Columbia. Seen here in a 1950s photo by Mabel Baker, the Lloyd house included window frames of a design that was very similar to that of the Hopwood house, suggesting that the firm may have built both houses around the same time. The largely undocumented careers and early deaths of Dyer P. Edmonds and David Hopwood reflect one typical pattern among early builders in the Wabash Valley. Those who lived longer left more evidence. Joseph Willis was born to a Quaker family in Philadelphia in 1808 and settled in Logansport in the late 1830s during the boom accompanying the construction of the canal through town. In 1837 and 1838, Willis partnered with Edwin J. Peck to build two bridges across the Wabash at Logansport. This connection is particularly interesting. Edwin Peck had come to Indiana in 1833 as an employee of the New York architects Town and Davis, superintending the firm's Indiana State House project, before going out on his own to build multiple branches for the State Bank of Indiana, including those in Logansport, Lafayette, and Terre Haute. It's unclear whether Willis worked with Peck on the branch banks or any other projects in this period. In May 1839, Joseph Willis was paid $30 for drawing plans for a courthouse for Cass County and secured the construction contract the following month. Construction of the Cutstone building was incomplete by the contract deadline in 1841, and Willis and the county agreed to a mutual release of contract. A subsequent contractor finished the shell of the building a year later, but the interior was not occupied until 1844. Willis's design for Cass County appears to have been the second Greek Revival courthouse built in Indiana. The first was the Clinton County Courthouse of 1837, designed by John Elder, who'd come to Indianapolis from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. These designs by Elder and Willis marked a shift away from the cubic federal type that had been dominant in Indiana County since the 18-teens and introduced the Grecian temple forms used for most Indiana courthouses into the 1860s, as we'll see again later. Willis probably designed a new courthouse for Fulton County in 1846. Later, county histories record that it was designed by a Joseph Miles of Logansport, and no Joseph Miles appears in Logansport in any record, so it was probably a misspelling of Joseph Willis. In 1846, Willis and contractor Abraham Graffus built a bridge across the Eel River at Logansport, replacing a ford on the Michigan Road. Willis's other Logansport projects have not been identified, but a handful of other Greek Revival buildings in the city may have been designed by him, including the 1845 Pollard House and the 1848 Cass County Seminary. He likely designed and built many other more modest buildings, or buildings for which no documentation has survived. In 1847, Joseph Willis of Logansport was appointed architect of the Indiana Hospital for the Insane in Indianapolis. One of the commissioners who selected him was Edmund Peck, who had retired from construction and now served as a bank and railroad director and philanthropist. Willis and his family relocated to the rapidly growing capital city, where he quickly became one of Indiana's leading architects. Indianapolis architect John Elder had prepared the initial design for the hospital, following a branching wing plan advocated by Philadelphia psychiatrist Thomas Story Kirkbride, and thus known as the Kirkbride Plan. But he was unable to fulfill his contracted duties. Construction began in May 1847, with Willis replacing Elder a month later. Willis appears to have conferred with Elder on some matters, but he seems to have transformed Elder's design by the addition of high-style Greek Revival elements, including a modified portico and more elaborate cupolas. Elder appears to have initially secured the 1848 commission for a second major state institution, the Indiana Institute for Educating the Deaf and Dumb. After preparing a preliminary design, Elder, hoping to assuage his financial difficulties, went west during the gold rush, where he died shortly after. Willis served as project architect from at least December 1849, when he presented a report outlining his improvements to Elder's design, until he resigned in June 1850, 3 months before the hospital opened. Willis's 1848 design for the Indianapolis Masonic Hall received extensive praise. This building fronted Washington Street, the city's main street and part of the National Road, at one corner of the State House Square. Above a commercial ground floor rose a Greek Doric temple of brick, stuccoed to imitate cut stone, and wrapped by a cast iron balcony along the entirety of its 2 street fronts. An 1850 description reported that the public hall strikes persons entering it with wonder, surprise, and admiration at its splendor and chasteness of finish. At its completion in 1850, the building was brilliantly lighted up by a private gas lighting system. Relatively little is known of Willis's life during this period. He was a Freemason and a member of the Society of Carpenters and Joiners of the city of Indianapolis. In 1849, during an outbreak of smallpox, the city council paid Willis $5 to design a hospital. It's likely that he completed many other projects for which no documentation survives. After 3 years of successful practice in Indianapolis, Willis's sudden resignation and departure in the summer of 1850 is surprising. It was a rapidly growing city of 8,000 inhabitants with ample project opportunities, drawing architects from other cities. As the designer of some of the state's largest and most celebrated buildings, Willis was favorably positioned to secure public and private commissions. Following his resignation from the Indianapolis projects in 1850, Willis moved to Jackson, Mississippi, where he'd been recruited to replace local architect William Gibbons in the design of the Mississippi Lunatic Asylum. Willis was forced to demolish Gibbons's incomplete building and begin again, completing the hospital in 1855. William Gibbons had also designed a new city hall for Jackson in 1847, but the building collapsed shortly after Willis arrived at Jackson. And Willis was once again hired to clean up Gibbons' mistakes. Willis also designed courthouses for Rankin and Madison counties in Mississippi in 1853 and 1855. He was likely in an unusual position as a Quaker-born Northerner in the deep South of the 1850s. He's known to have attended meetings opposing the slave states' repeated threats of secession. Despite the challenging context, Willis seems to have prospered in Mississippi. In 1857, an employee of the Weldon brothers, a firm of architects and builders based in Rodney, Mississippi, wrote that the Weldons were sure to get a job for a new courthouse in Vicksburg because Joseph Willis had decided not to pursue it. Willis relocated to Memphis in 1858, maintaining a successful practice until his death in 1883 at age 75. Willis's career reflects another common pattern among early builders in the Wabash Valley, settled periods interspersed with long-distance moves. Frequent and distant moves were common for Americans living in an era of steamboats, canals, and railroads. Construction booms could come to an end when a prosperous port was bypassed by a railroad, or in one of the many economic crises of the period. Architects and builders seem to have often had to choose between moving or changing occupations. Willis's many moves seem to have opened up opportunities for aspiring architects to establish new practices following his departure. This was particularly true in Indianapolis, where Willis and John Elder left within a few months of each other. Francis Costigan, who had a successful practice in the booming Ohio River port of Madison during the 1840s, appears to have come to Indianapolis in the wake of Willis's departure. While Willis had completed the Hospital for the Insane and the Institute for the Deaf just before his resignation, engravings of both buildings published in 1855 bear the attribution F. Costigan Architect. Period sources do not document Costigan's role on the projects, although he was responsible for later additions to these buildings. Costigan did, however, serve as architect for the Indiana Institute for the Education of the Blind, the third of the three great state asylum projects. Like the other two, it was initially designed by John Elder, and Willis would have been the logical choice for the project had he not moved to Mississippi. Costigan took over the project and achieved fame as the architect of the modern state institution. As a result of this, Costigan was selected to design a similar building for the state of Kentucky in Louisville in 1855. The mobility of Americans in this period is highlighted by the life of Samuel D. Menser. Born near Baltimore in 1816, Menser was orphaned at age 18 and was bound out by the Orphans' Court for 3 years to learn the carpenter's trade at Boonesboro, Maryland. In the 19th century, the age of majority was 21, so all persons under that age were legally classified as infants. In 1837, shortly before the expiration of his indenture, Menser ran away, traveling to Wheeling, West Virginia on foot, then to Louisville, Kentucky by steamboat. He worked for 3 months in Jeffersonville, Indiana, before traveling down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers on a flatboat, landing at Vicksburg, where he would work for almost 2 years. Menser made 2 visits to New Orleans and survived a smallpox outbreak before coming north in 1838 to join a group of his Boonesboro friends who'd settled in Attica. He worked as a builder from 1839 to 1854, erecting more than 100 buildings in Attica. Then, at around age 38, Menser retired to the grocery trade, kept a livery stable for 7 or 8 years, built and operated a public bathhouse, spent 15 years driving an omnibus between the depot and the Revere House Hotel, and finally worked as the tender of the Attica toll bridge over the Wabash until his death in 1894 at age 77. Menser's career continues the theme of travel and introduces another common pattern, the builder who retires to another occupation in the prime of life. Another Maryland-born builder was John Urey. Born in Frederick County, Maryland in 1804, Urey moved with his family to Montgomery County, Ohio in 1812. He engaged in farming with his father until age 19, when, feeling a desire to acquire some of the mechanical arts, he apprenticed himself to a carpenter in Dayton, Ohio, in whose employ he remained for 3 years. He married Mary Schill in 1828. Hearing word of the Wabash country, Urey and 2 other young men journeyed west on horseback, arriving at Lafayette in 1828. With the capital accumulated during his labor as a carpenter, Urey purchased a lot on 2nd Street, then returned to Dayton. After a few days at home, he went to Cincinnati, where he procured employment. Dissatisfied with Cincinnati after 2 months, he returned to Dayton and announced his intention of moving permanently to Lafayette. His parents wished him to stay with them, but Urey persisted, embarking on a canal boat for Cincinnati, then traveling by steamboat down the Ohio and up the Wabash. The boat ran aground on the lower Wabash, and Urey and 4 other passengers decided to proceed upriver on foot. They walked to Vincennes and engaged a wagon to take them to Terre Haute, and then another to take them to Perryville, walking the rest of the way to Lafayette, where they arrived in April 1829. Here, a new difficulty met him. The boat, with its chest of tools, was still stuck fast aground in southern Indiana and did not arrive. As a consequence, he could not do any work to earn any money. So he spent the time clearing trees and grubbing out the stumps on his own lot, and contracting for lumber to build a house when his toolbox arrived. In 1833, Urey and Raleigh Swearingen appear to have finished out the courtroom in the new Tippecanoe County Courthouse. Urey received a contract to build store buildings for Joseph Hanna and John McCormick, completing the work 2 weeks after the steamer arrived with his chest of tools. Using the proceeds from this project, Urey was able to build his own house. He then built a barn for Colonel Johnson, a hotel keeper, and used the money from that job to return to Ohio for his wife. He left Lafayette in September 1829, traveling on foot to Dayton, Ohio, and returning soon after with his family and household goods in a wagon. In the spring of 1836, Urey sold his original property and built a new house at the corner of 2nd and Alabama, where he would live for 40 years. We can see that house here in the 1870s. Urey eventually gave up construction for other business opportunities. The 1850 census lists him as a blacksmith and plow manufacturer, with his 19-year-old son John working as a chairmaker. In 1865, Urey and his sons, who operated a dry goods store, purchased Lafayette Woolen Mill. He died in 1866 at age 82. Now, some of you have probably heard of the Urey family because in a fun bit of Indiana trivia, John Urey's grandson Ray would survive polio and become a celebrated Olympic athlete, competing from 1900 to 1908. He set multiple records for the number of gold medals that stood for 100 years until Michael Phelps tied with him and then surpassed him in 2008. But now back to our story. Another Lafayette builder who changed occupations was Anthony Cordy. Born in the Kingdom of Hanover in 1821, Cordy settled in Lafayette about 1844 during the Canal boom and at the beginning of a massive wave of immigration from the German-speaking states. He seems to have specialized in the construction of commercial buildings. In 1851, scaffolding collapsed while Cordy was building the P&O wall block on the south side of the square. Cordy's leg was broken and all of his workers were seriously injured. He decided to give up construction, opening a grocery store and living the life of a successful merchant till his death in 1904 at age 83. James A. Kleiser introduces building as a part-time trade. Born in Bourbon County, Kentucky in 1818, Kleiser moved to Montgomery County, Indiana in 1834. He and his brother began working as carpenters, building houses, a wool carding factory, and a church in Waveland. Kleiser lost 3 fingers in a fishing accident in 1841. He eventually returned to work, but faced mounting debt. Kleiser decided to sell his Waveland property, pay off his debts, and move to Lafayette in the spring of 1844. Lafayette was booming as the terminus of the canal, and Kleiser apparently found sufficient success to finance an expensive educational trip in the fall of 1844. Leaving his business in the hands of a foreman, Kleiser went east to learn more about the construction of buildings, railroads, and bridges. He traveled up the canal to Toledo and by steamboat to Detroit, Buffalo, and Niagara Falls. He continued by train, steamboat, and stagecoach to Lewiston, Oswego, Rome, Schenectady, Albany, Boston, Hartford, New Haven, New York City, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. Kleiser returned west via Harper's Ferry, Cumberland, Pittsburgh, Wheeling, Cincinnati, and Madison, Indiana. Although nothing is known of the particular buildings he visited, this extensive trip would have provided a broad picture of up-to-date construction in the eastern states. Upon his return, Kleiser found Lafayette humming with news of the California gold rush. In February 1849, he went west to California. After finding about $10,000 worth of gold, Kleiser left California in November 1851, returning to Indiana via Panama and New Orleans. Kleiser used some of his gold to purchase a 200-acre farm near Lafayette and resumed his work as a combination farmer and master builder. His only known project is a schoolhouse in Lafayette. The Southern School, begun in 1852, was a 2-story brick building on South 4th Street. Kleiser suffered setbacks during his other occupation, farming, while this project was under construction. He twice planted 50 acres in corn in 1852, only to have it killed by unusually timed frosts in May and September. In the fall of 1852, Kleiser began talking of going back to California. During the winter, as he completed the Southern School, Kleiser sold out all of his possessions and prepared to emigrate. He initially operated a grist mill in Northern California before settling west of Sacramento, where he founded the town of Cloverdale in 1859. Kleiser would remain in Cloverdale for the rest of his life. He continued to work as a contractor for buildings, railroads, and bridges in California, eventually retiring to focus on his olive orchard in the years before his death in 1906 at age 88. Richard Treadway continues the theme of the part-time builder who moves west. Born in Kentucky in 1804, Treadway settled in Warren County in 1830. He built most of the public buildings in Williamsport, including the 1845 Warren County Office Building, the 1849 Warren County Jail, and the 1850 Warren County Seminary. The 1850 census lists Treadway as a mail contractor living in Williamsport, indicating that post office matters were then his primary occupation. Treadway moved west to New London, Missouri by 1854 and is listed as a farmer in the 1860 census. He would die in Missouri in 1866. Josiah Scheidler was another part-time architect. Born in Montgomery County, Ohio in 1821, Scheidler came to Lafayette sometime before 1847 and was part owner of a warehouse. At some point in the 1850s, Scheidler also began working as an architect and builder. About 1856, he built an Italian villa on the southern outskirts of Lafayette for H. Sawyer, who opened it as the Junction Hotel in January 1857. The house was adapted from a design in Samuel Sloan's 1852 pattern book, The Model Architect. A special feature of the Junction Hotel was its manner of construction. It was a gravel wall or concrete house. Many American builders experimented with cast-in-place concrete wall construction during the 1840s and 1850s, rediscovering a lost technology from the ancient Romans. The technology was popularized in part by Orson Squire Fowler's 1853 book, A Home for All, or the gravel wall and octagon mode of building, which advocated for octagonal houses with concrete walls. In 1860, the Lafayette Daily Courier reported that Scheidler had built several gravel wall houses in and around Lafayette that year. Although we know that he built several buildings, the Junction Hotel is the only one that's identified in period sources. Scheidler moved to Benton County in the early 1860s, operating a hotel in Oxford until his death in 1876. In 1866, the Courier reported that concrete construction was nothing new to people in Lafayette, citing Scheidler's work a decade earlier and other buildings, including a group of 4 concrete cottages recently built for H.T. Sample on Wabash Avenue. 3 of those 4 cottages appear to remain today at the northeast corner of Wabash Avenue and Green Street. Matthew J. McBird continues our theme of mobility. Born in Oneida County, New York in 1819, McBird is believed to have worked in Washington, D.C. in the 1840s and in Cleveland, Ohio in the early 1850s. He practiced in Lafayette from 1852 until about 1855. McBird's first known Lafayette project was a house designed for lawyer Benjamin O. Deming, drawings of which won a prize at the 1852 Indiana State Fair. It's unclear whether this house was actually built, and we do not have the drawings, but the State Fair catalog states that it was a villa in the Norman style. Here are a few examples of Norman-style villas from architectural pattern books that McBird may have used in his design. In March 1853, McBird advertised in Lafayette newspapers that he had recently come from Cleveland, had opened an office, and was prepared to give designs and specifications for buildings and structures of all kinds, as well as instruction in mechanical and architectural drafting and methods of constructing staircases and railings. 2 months later, the Daily Courier announced that the Second Presbyterian Church had selected McBird's design for their new building at the northeast corner of 6th and Main. Here we find a typical challenge in the work of these early architects. Period documents attribute the church, which was built between 1855 and 1858, to 3 different architects. McBird is the first. An 1854 source lists it as being designed by Van Osdell and Olmsted of Chicago, and other sources say that it was built by George Brown of Lafayette. Brown probably served as the contractor rather than the architect, but at this time it's not possible to determine whether it was actually designed by McBird or Van Osdell and Olmsted. Also in 1853, a row of old wood frame buildings on the west side of the public square burned down, and William F. Reynolds hired McBird to design a new building for the site. The W.F. Reynolds building would survive until 1900, when it was torn down to make way for the Thiem and Schutzler building that survives today. By August 1853, McBird had formed a partnership with John Lawson, another architect and contractor, and the two advertised for 10 to 15 good carpenters to apply at their office at 5th and Ferry. McBird prepared the site plan for the 1853 Indiana State Fair, which was held in Lafayette on land at the top of 4th Street Hill. McBird removed from Lafayette to Logansport in 1854 or 1855. He is best known for his striking Carroll County Courthouse of 1855 to 56 in Delphi, which would remain in use until 1916, when it was replaced by the present building. In 1856, he received a patent for an improved machine for the sawing of stone or marble. In 1859, McBird designed a new courthouse for Pulaski County in Winnemac. The commissioners reportedly sought a building similar to Willis's 1846 design in neighboring Fulton County, having obtained a copy of his plans, but McBird gave them a design that was similar in plan but fashionably up to date in its exterior appearance. The scale of McBird's two courthouses reflect the differing conditions in their respective counties. Carroll County's population was roughly 3 times that of Pulaski County in the 1850s, and thus they could afford a bigger and nicer courthouse. Nothing is known of McBird's work in Logansport, where he would remain until 1869. He then moved to Council Bluffs, Iowa, practicing until 1880, when he relocated to Denver, Colorado, where he remained one of the city's leading architects until his death in 1903 at age 83. In contrast to many of the preceding examples, some builders lived a more settled life. This was, of course, easier in a large town with sustained growth. Perhaps the best documented builder active in Lafayette during this period was Strother Moore. Born in Virginia in 1812, Moore came to Lafayette in 1835 at age 22, and was later remembered as one of the town's leading contractors. To date, nothing is known of Moore's first 15 years of practice, other than that in October 1850, a fire broke out in his carpentry shop, spreading to and destroying the adjacent Christian church. Between 1850 and 1852, Moore built the Porter County Courthouse in Valparaiso, 90 miles north of Lafayette. It appears to have closely followed the design of the 1849 courthouse in neighboring LaPorte County, which was designed by Chicago architect John Mills Van Osdale. Moore's sister-in-law lived in Valparaiso, and he made his office in her house during the construction. His niece later recalled, "At that time, there were no banking facilities in Valparaiso. The gold to pay for the materials and labor for the courthouse was deposited with mother, and the clerical works and pay envelopes were made up on her kitchen table." Similar scenes may have played out elsewhere as builders lived in hotels and boarding houses while building their out-of-town projects. Moore appears to have maintained his practice in Lafayette while building the Porter County Courthouse. In April 1851, a house painter named James Holland sued Moore for non-payment for work on a project referenced as the Fowler Brick House, apparently owned by wealthy merchant Moses Fowler. An invoice that Holland submitted as evidence in the suit suggests work on a small to mid-sized house, and references to barge boards and window arches suggest it was probably in the Gothic Revival style. The connection of Moore to Moses Fowler in 1851 is particularly interesting. Fowler had become enamored with the Gothic Revival style after visiting the Connecticut home of one of his New York business associates in 1849 or 1850, and had purchased a number of books on modern architecture in New York, including A.J. Downing's The Architecture of Country Houses. Fowler began construction on a Gothic villa on the outskirts of Lafayette in May 1851. The Fowler House's plan and exterior closely follow a design published in the prior month's issue of A.J. Downing's magazine, The Horticulturist. Many of its exterior details are taken from The Architecture of Country Houses, while much of the interior woodwork and plasterwork follow designs in David Henry Arnott's 1850 book, Gothic Architecture Applied to Modern Residences. The Fowler House's builders, possibly led by Moore, synthesized these published designs to achieve a level of unified Gothic Revival expression unmatched in Indiana during this period. In 1853, Moore received the contract to build 2 of Lafayette's public schoolhouses, the Central and Eastern schools. Had he not left for California, James Kleiser would likely have been favored for these projects based on his experience building the Southern School a few months earlier. But Kleiser was gone and Moore got the job. The 1860 census lists Moore as a carpenter, an occupation shared by his 19-year-old son, William, who later worked as a stair builder following Strother's death in 1866. A copy of Samuel Sloan's 1852 pattern book, The Model Architect, now in the collection of TCHA, is inscribed with William H. Moore's name and may have originally been used by Strother Moore in his practice in the 1850s. Moore might have been the builder of several houses of designs derived from this book. Strother Moore's younger son, W. Scott Moore, became a prominent Indianapolis architect in the 1890s. While we can see only flickers of Moore's long career, His similarly settled contemporary George Brown specialized in a well-documented building type. Born near Belfast, Ireland in 1807 to a Protestant family, Brown came to the United States with his parents at age 16. He was apprenticed to an architect in Rochester, New York, before going west to Cincinnati around 1830. Brown lived in Hamilton, Ohio from 1834 to 1843. In the latter year, he relocated to Lafayette to build a new Tippecanoe County courthouse. Brown's design reflected the Greek Revival style, the dominant American style of the 1840s. Here we can compare it to the design by a Connecticut architect working at the same time. The two were likely working from the same source books. The building was completed in 1845 and established Brown as one of the foremost courthouse architects in the state. Joseph Willis's move from Logansport to Indianapolis in 1847 also left Brown as the leading architect in the Wabash Valley. Between 1848 and 1863, Brown would design and build courthouses for White, Jasper, Benton, and Stark counties, earning him the nickname Courthouse Brown. Brown also built other buildings within the region, including Lafayette's Second Presbyterian Church, which he probably didn't design, and St. Ignatius Academy, which stood just west of St. Mary's Catholic Church. Brown died in 1889. His son, George Sloan Brown, followed him in the construction business, working as a contractor and architect in Lafayette from 1860 till his death in 1921. Brown was not the only British builder to settle in the Wabash Valley. George Bevan was born in England in 1825, moved to Canada about 1833, settled in Logansport in the early 1850s. Bevan worked as an architect and builder and operated a sash blind and door factory, as well as a planing mill that produced flooring and bentwood wagon components. He was responsible for several high-style Logansport houses built during the 1850s. Bevan was also the contractor for the 1855 Kendrick House, designed by Chicago architects Olmsted and Nicholson, and based on a design in Samuel Sloan's model architect. The 1860 census lists Bevan as a master carpenter. He continued to design and build while operating multiple businesses and serving in local government roles, including as fire chief and as mayor of Logansport, until his death in 1875 at age 50. The stories of these early architects and builders in the Wabash Valley reflect the diversity of experience among practitioners in this period and showcase several career arcs that seem to have been common in the region. Some moved often and over long distances, while others were more settled. Some engaged in construction in addition to other occupations. Some worked as builders for only a portion of their lives, while others remained in practice until their deaths. The stories of these builders represent a key phase in the development of the profession of architecture in the Wabash Valley and set the stage for the emergence of self-styled architects in the years after the Civil War. Thank you. We have time for questions if anybody has questions.
When the style of buildings, also the big buildings, is this similar to like the way they built barns or I like
So the framing of most of these buildings up into the 1850s, it would have been timber framing. It would be similar to the way we would build a barn. The elements aren't as big, but the frame tends to have larger, say 6x6 or 8x8 members that are mortise and tenon together, and it's diagonal bracing. In the 1850s, balloon framing, which is similar to what we use now, became popular, and it was a much faster way to build. It didn't require as much skill. So when the census was recording some people as house joiners, it really meant they were specialized in the work of joinery that was necessary for those timber frame components. But the advantage of a balloon frame is you just give some guys some hammers and nails and they can nail some boards together, and you don't have to have any specialized skills. So that changed pretty quickly, starting in the 1850s. Really by the 1870s, timber framing is not used except for barns and other large buildings. It's a mix. So by the 1850s, much of the Wabash Valley would have had very little tree cover. It would have all been clear cut. So we know that when Moses Fowler was building his house in the early 1850s, he received a shipment of pine lumber from Pittsburgh. And I have no idea why they were shipping lumber from out east because it would have had to come all the way down the Ohio and then back up to Wabash. But a lot of buildings in this region in that period were being built with poplar and black walnut, which are the most plentiful local woods, but they were shipping things in from other places even in the early day. Most of these buildings would have had foundations of dry laid limestone, of the lower quality limestone that was easy to get. Not necessarily the quarried stone that we would get from Bedford today. At some points, they were building brick foundations with locally made clay brick, which is very soft. Wasn't a very good solution, but typically foundations in this period are dry laid, relatively flat pieces of limestone just stacked together.
Like you're talking about all the, there's so many of these old farm now. See that there are obviously some classically styled.
Yep.
Were those designed by someone or that kind of?
They were designed by people like these early architects and builders. And for all the courthouses things they built, they probably built 100 plain houses and sheds and any other building you can imagine. But we just don't have documentation of it. But yes, they would look at these architecture books that they could get from the East and they could get ideas and then they would adapt to that. So they might take a door or a window off of the design. Sometimes they build the whole thing, as we saw in some of the big fancy houses, but a lot of times they were just getting bits and pieces here and there and applying them to a simpler design that was easy to build.
It seems like a lot of those big brick, 3-story, they almost look like they're the same building.
Yeah, in the Lafayette area, especially houses built in the 1840s and 1850s, a lot of them are it's a gable front, so the roof's on the front. It's a front parlor and a stair hall next to it, and it's usually 2 or 3 rooms deep, and you see tons of those around. That was the most common form in our region, and it was you see it up toward Delphi and down toward Attica, but in other places different forms were common. But yes, you often will find there were probably hundreds of these houses that were very similar, all built with the same.
Was there any permitting or regulations?
There were permits to place building material in the public streets. And you will often find complaints in the newspapers that, the contractor working on the opera house is leaving blocks of stone in the street, nobody can get by. And you often find that, but there were no real building regulations until around 1900. Architects were not licensed until after 1900 anywhere in the US. So there wasn't as much care for public safety in this period.
It sounds still slick. Great feature.
Yes. So I think the earliest public sewers in Lafayette, I would think, are probably the 1840s or 1850s, but I would say for the most part, no. But many of these buildings would have been built with systems to collect rainwater. Even if they didn't necessarily drink the rainwater, it was distilled water that you could use for cleaning and laundering. And that was just a normal thing. You would capture all the water from the roof to use at home, often in a cistern in the ground. The Lafayette central waterworks system was not built until the 1870s. And I think gas, so the first gas that was available was in the 1850s. Lafayette was one of the few cities that had a gas lighting plant. It was what we now call coal gasification. Extremely dirty and toxic process, but it produced a gas from coal that burned bright and relatively clean at the other end of it. And it was really the first public utility. And I think the Lafayette Gas Works was chartered in 1856. So pretty quickly we had gas streetlights throughout that town. And many public buildings and larger houses had gas lighting. And sometimes they put them in late. But when if they were building either with gas available or anticipation of gas, they would lay pipes to the walls and get it ready. But I've seen plenty of examples where they put it in 5 years after a house was built.
Talk more about the gravel houses or the octagon. Kind of went over that quickly.
Yes.
To me, it sounds awful.
Well, So the octagon, it was a fad in the 1850s. Orson Squire Fowler, the guy who popularized it, was a phrenologist, which was a pseudoscience that was popular in that period. That they thought by feeling the shape of your skull, they could determine qualities about you. That, oh, okay, your head's really flat right here, so you must be a generous person. You have a bump here, that means that you're going to be a criminal. And it was just crazy. But so he was very famous for that. But then he came up with this idea that if we live in octagons, we will all be happy people and we'll have a wonderful society. And he published this book, and it started a trend. And you find a number of octagon buildings being built around the country shortly after. But this idea of concrete wall construction was thought of as a more durable, permanent form of construction. So the kind of brick that was used in this period was made of local clay. It was fired in kilns that were not at the high temperature that we have today in natural gas kilns. So brick was relatively soft. It was kind of spongy, tended to deteriorate. Whereas they thought, well, these concrete walls, they could last forever. The ancient Romans built them and they're still around. But they didn't quite understand the formulas. I mean, we have much more scientific data today for how to mix concrete and aggregate and just how all this works. So these were all really experiments that people were reading a book and it's like, oh, okay, I'll go try it. And I was actually really shocked to find that the concrete houses on Wabash Avenue will survive because there's such a rare thing to find in this region. But this was a period of great experimentation. People are trying all kinds of new things. You know, cast iron is another innovative material of this period. This idea that, you know, we can make whatever we want and we'll make it out of iron. It'll last forever and it'll be maintenance free. Which turned out to not be true. Iron rusts. But lots of technological innovation in this period. With a lot of it, they were using levers and pulleys and sort of that simple physics type of work. There's a photograph of the Montgomery County Courthouse in Crawfordsville being built in the 1870s, and the tower, it's a brick and stone building. The tower was wood frame wrapped in sheet metal, and there's a picture of them hoisting the timbers up to frame the tower, and they just have essentially a very large pulley and hoist system to lift up, and they use horses or mules to get the force to pull builds. Yes, often like a tripod lift, but and again, there was very little safety regulation in this period, so there were often accidents on these construction sites. I've read plenty of accounts of, you know, they're hoisting a big stone into place and the scaffolding gives way and somebody's crushed to death. It was a very dangerous time, but they found ways to do things that are hard for us to imagine how to do.
In terms of building failures, then, where they like maybe some guy just saying an architect, two or three go together and the whole thing come down.
There were some, I don't know of as many here, but when Joseph Willis went to Mississippi, he replaced an architect whose buildings had failed repeatedly. Down there, part of that may have been that they have really unstable soils there that are not like, we think clay is difficult here, but in the deep south, it's like building a quicksand. So that may not have been there, but yes, you wouldn't necessarily have a guarantee that somebody knew what they were doing.
Any other questions? All right, thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you.